All right, let's dive into one of the trickiest, but honestly most important topics on your AQA GCSE history paper, the conflicts in the Gulf and Afghanistan. I know this 20-year period is super complex, but don't you worry. We're going to map it all out for you, creating a really clear revision guide to help you absolutely smash it. Let's get going. And that's a really fair question, right? If you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by it all, you are definitely not alone. This whole period is just packed with complicated events and alliances that seem to change all the time. But the good news is, we've structured this whole thing to follow your AQA syllabus exactly. So you'll have a clear, logical path through everything you absolutely must know for that exam. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the initial tensions simmering in the Gulf that led to the very first Gulf War. Then, we'll pivot to the rise of al-Qaeda and the war in Afghanistan that followed. After that, we'll unpack the hugely controversial 2003 Iraq War, and then, to wrap it all up, we'll pull everything together by looking at the key themes that connect all of these events, which is perfect for crafting those top-level answers in your exam. Okay, let's kick off with part 1. You see, to really get a grip on the wars of the 90s and 2000s, you first have to understand the instability that was already boiling over in the Gulf region. This is the foundation for absolutely everything that comes next. This slide really paints a picture of the perfect storm brewing in the region. I mean, think about it. You've got Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, with this massive army left over from its war with Iran. But at the same time, it was drowning in debt. That kind of pressure makes a leader do desperate things. Then you've got Western powers and Russia all laser-focused on the region's oil. And on top of all that, the long-running Israeli-Palestinian conflict was stirring up some really deep anti-Western feelings. It was basically a powder keg, just waiting for a spark. And in 1990, that powder keg just exploded. So, step 1, Saddam Hussein invades his tiny, super oil-rich neighbor Kuwait, thinking it'll solve his money problems. Step 2, the UN reacts, and fast. This was a pretty big moment of international cooperation, with leaders like George H.W. Bush and Margaret Thatcher putting together a huge coalition. Step 3, the military campaign, Operation Desert Storm, is a quick success. But step 4, the consequences, that's what really shapes the next 20 years. Saddam is left in power, but, and this is critical, U.S. troops are now stationed in Saudi Arabia. Remember that detail, because it becomes a massive source of anger for groups like al-Qaeda. Right, let's move to our next section and see how all of this builds. After that first Gulf War, the whole focus of the conflict starts to shift. It's not just about nations fighting nations anymore. A new global kind of enemy shows up, and that leads to a very, very different kind of war. And that new enemy was al-Qaeda. It's so important to understand what they were. Led by Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda wasn't a country. It was a global terrorist network. Its main goal was to attack Western powers, especially the United States, who they accused of meddling in the Muslim world. And they pointed specifically to things like, you guessed it, the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. This ideology led directly to the horrific 9/11 attacks in 2001, which just changed everything. The U.S. tracked al-Qaeda to Afghanistan, where they were being protected by the government there, the Taliban regime. The military response was incredibly fast. As you can see, by October 2001, a US and UK operation was underway, and by December, the Taliban had been toppled. But here's a crucial lesson for your exam. Overthrowing a government is not the same as winning the peace. The years that followed, from 2002 on, were just this brutal, long struggle to build a new government while fighting a Taliban that was coming back strong. So the really crucial point here is that 9/11 launched what President George W. Bush called the War on Terror. This wasn't a war against one country. It was a global campaign against terrorist groups and any nations that supported them. He called those nations rogue states. His main ally in this was the British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and Afghanistan was target number 1 precisely because its Taliban government was giving shelter to al-Qaeda. And this brings us to the third and final major conflict in our period, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, if the first Gulf War was a moment of pretty broad international agreement, this war was the total opposite. A deeply, deeply controversial and divisive sequel. This is the central question, and one you might well face in an exam. Why, in the shadow of 9/11, did the US and the UK suddenly shift their focus from al-Qaeda in Afghanistan back to Saddam Hussein in Iraq? Well, the official reasons given for the invasion sparked this intense, worldwide debate and a lot of suspicion. Let's dig into why. And this just illustrates the divide perfectly. The arguments for the invasion were centered on the claim that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, and that he had links to al-Qaeda. They also pointed to his terrible human rights record as another justification. But the arguments against were really powerful. UN inspectors couldn't actually find any WMDs, there was huge international opposition, and a lot of people were worried an invasion would just make the region even more unstable and actually increase terrorism. The invasion did succeed in one thing, removing Saddam Hussein from power. But the aftermath was just catastrophic. Instead of a stable democracy, Iraq fell into a violent insurgency against the coalition forces. The war became a recruiting tool for anti-Western terrorist groups all around the world. Even with a troop surge in 2007 to try and calm things down, by the end of this period in 2009, Iraq was still a deeply unstable place. So, now that we've walked through the three main conflicts, let's connect the dots. For your exam, being able to talk about the big themes that run through this entire period, that is how you show you really truly get it. These 5 themes here are the keys that tie everything together, and they are perfect for building arguments in your essays. Notice how oil is always a factor in the background. The role of the US and the UK is the main thread connecting all 3 conflicts. You see that huge shift from state-on-state war to fighting a global network like Al-Qaeda. The idea of a rogue state is used to justify invading both Afghanistan and Iraq. And maybe the biggest lesson of all is about the limits of military power. Winning the war is one thing, but as we saw in both Afghanistan and Iraq, winning the peace is a much, much harder challenge. And that leaves us with one final thought. These events didn't just happen in the past. They fundamentally reshaped the world we live in right now. So, what do you think is the most significant legacy? Is it the ongoing instability in the Middle East, the nature of modern terrorism, or the changed relationship between the West and the rest of the world? Really thinking about that question is the perfect way to bring all your revision together. Good luck!